You're listening to World Talk Radio, Studio A.
The Lincoln Museum, born 1928, died 2008. We'll talk about the life of this wonderful institution when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.
My husband and I met at a
strip mall
dance. It was a beautiful old
strip mall.
I had seen my husband before at a big rally at the
highway on-ramp
for all the men who had enlisted. He was going to war. 4 years later, we married at the little
convenience store
downtown.
When we lose a historic place, we lose a part of who we are. To learn how you can help protect places in your community, visit nationaltrust.org. History is in our hands. A message brought to you by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Ad Council.
It's a wake-up call. It's time to get serious about preparation and to understand that the threat is very real.
This is a message from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, recorded by Roger Kilfoyle, New York City firefighter. The topic, getting serious.
It's irrelevant where you live or how many people live in your community or other variables like that. It's America. America's the target, not just New York. We know there are some positive things that you can do to better prepare yourself and your family. It's simple steps to prepare yourself for events that may be out of your control. So, having these little supplies together, you can prepare for problems that may happen.
Learn to be prepared at www.ready.gov or call for a free brochure, 1-800-BE-READY. That's 1-800-237-3239. A public service message brought to you by the Ad Council.
Listen. The world is talking. World Talk Radio, Studio A.
Welcome back to Civil War Talk Radio. I'm Jerry Prokopovich, and today our show focuses on the Lincoln Museum in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a museum dedicated to the life and times of Abraham Lincoln, founded by the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company originally in 1928 with Lewis Warren as its first director. As we discussed, as I talked about in our first segment. And that brings us to the years of growth for the museum, how it became what it is today and what it will still be for a few weeks until its closing on June 30, 2008. The reason for having no guest today is I worked 9 years at the museum. I figure I know as much about it as anyone who was there at that time, and there won't be another opportunity to share these thoughts while the museum is still with us, so I thought I would take advantage of the chance to do that today. As I said, I worked there beginning in 1993. There were many interesting times there. Things got off perhaps on something of the wrong foot. As I mentioned in the first segment, the director of the museum was newly hired just before I was, but the person above her to whom the director reported was a longtime life insurance executive. She reported directly to the CEO. She was a very powerful person and within the company, and she had reasons not to care for me or for the museum director, for that matter. One time we were discussing the possibility of the museum purchasing an artwork, a statue. It was to be the work of the sculptor who produced something you can see, I think, still there today in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the main square outside the Wills House where Lincoln spent the night before he gave the Gettysburg Address. There is a life-size statue in realistic colors of Abraham Lincoln, and he is talking to a tourist, a statue of a tourist, a modern-day tourist, with, I don't recall if it's just the man himself or if he has family with him. And Lincoln is wearing his Lincolnian gear, but he's talking to somebody, a modern person. Well, this was somewhat controversial when it was installed there, but in the early 90s, in the first year I was there, 1993, I believe, we got the call from the boss, the director's boss. Oh, come up and talk to me. We might be able to buy one of the statues from this guy. Wouldn't that be a great thing for the museum? Now, already the director and I were trying to establish the autonomy of the museum as a cultural institution. It was not the plaything of the executives of the Lincoln Company, and most of them didn't treat it as such. But we were certainly reluctant to have them making decisions on acquisitions, which they could do. It's their money. But if we'd been hired to use our historical expertise to help make those kinds of decisions, then that's what we were going to do. So we pointed out some of the flaws of this plan, among them the controversy associated with the artwork, the fact that this was modern artwork and not really a historical piece at all. And the point we didn't make strongly enough at the time, but certainly comes to mind when you see the piece today or recently, which is that the modern tourist of 1990 in 2008 doesn't look modern anymore. Is a little time warp character from almost 20 years ago, wearing the clothes of the time. Men's fashions haven't changed that much. It's not that different. But he looks like somebody who's dressed out of his older brother's closet by accident. The clothes just don't look contemporary anymore. And it's kind of an odd piece. So we thought for many reasons it was not appropriate for the museum, and suggested it not be a piece like that not be obtained. It wasn't, but from that day on, the director and I were marked down as the academic snobs of the museum. We don't understand what the ordinary person wants. We're elitist. We're eggheads. To myself, I'm thinking, you hired a Harvard PhD and you don't want an egghead? What were you thinking? But there it is. Well, going back in our story to the founding of the museum, 1933, the Lincoln Museum grew through the Depression years. There were some substantial collections the museum obtained. Eventually, Lewis Warren took on an assistant who would succeed him as the museum's second full-time director, and that was R. Gerald McMurtry. And if you've studied Lincoln much, that name is familiar to you. He was a very successful director at the Lincoln Museum, also at the Abraham Lincoln Museum in Harrogate, in Harrogate, Tennessee, where Lincoln Memorial University is located. He ran that museum successfully. He collaborated with Mark E. Neely Jr. on the Insanity File, which I'll talk about momentarily, and generally established, he expanded Lincoln lore when he worked at the Lincoln Museum, and had a very successful tenure as museum director there. He had more interest perhaps than Warren did in collecting objects, three-dimensional objects, tchotchkes from Lincoln's presidential campaigns. In particular, there are a lot of political items entered the collection, and that helped make the museum a more visible and interesting place for people to visit. In the early 60s, I want to say 1961, the museum expanded again, moved to another location, still within the offices of the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company, but now down to the first floor, where visitors from the outside could more easily find it and make their way in and see what the museum was about. It would move yet again to another first-floor location in the 1970s. That's where it was when I arrived in 1993. Still somewhat hard to find, though. The building was an office building, not a place you would go unless you had business with an insurance company, so it wasn't really a warm and receptive place. As rules against smoking grew, for example, the insurance workers could no longer smoke at their desks. They had to come outside to smoke. So they would congregate around the revolving doors and create huge billowing clouds of toxic smoke, through which then busloads of school children would be marched on their way to the museum. Eventually we were able to get that policy changed. But the coexistence of an insurance company and a museum was always somewhat uneasy. even the volunteers of the museum, I can recall looking out the plate glass windows into the lobby at visitors who were mystified. Where do I go, having entered the lobby of this building? Where's the museum? I'm not here for insurance. And our volunteers, the ones when I got there, would kind of snicker and laugh at the ignorant people in the hall. We tried to change that culture and be nice to the visitors. That's why we're here. But sometimes it was amusing looking at them lost out there. Well, McMurtry ran the museum until the 1970s, when he was succeeded by Dr. Mark E. Neely, Jr. Neely was the first professionally trained doctoral degree-holding historian to run the museum, and took it in new directions that further made it one of the leading Lincoln museums in the country. He continued to collect documents that added to the museum's research collection. He was very interested in politics, in the imagery of politics, in many things. His research was of an extraordinarily high level. He published stories in Lincoln lore that were on a level with what you would find in academic journals. It was a lonely operation. Dr. Neely ran the place with his longtime assistant, Ruth Cook, and sometimes one or two other people, but it was not, there were not other historians around for him to chat with. He connected with people outside the museum, collaborated, for example, with Gabor Borit and Harold Holzer on the Lincoln Image, a landmark publication that used the Lincoln Museum's collection to show how Lincoln portrayed himself, how he consciously shaped his own visual image in the eyes of the American people. The museum thus was reasonably successful, drew, I would guess, maybe 20,000 visitors a year, many of them school children, and they came to see an exhibit last remodeled in the 1970s when Neely was there. That was quite attractive and written at a high level, not written down for children. Really a worthwhile place. That was the exhibit that I first saw in 1993 when I was invited to interview there, and I would have to say I was pleasantly surprised by the exhibit. Having not heard of this place previously, I wondered, what kind of museum does an insurance company have? Will it be a real museum? Will it be filled with pictures of Abraham Lincoln signing insurance contracts as if an attempt to sell product rather than teach history? Will it be what history museum people derisively call a book on a wall, just one panel after another of foam board graphic illustrations with captions that lifelessly take you from one thing to another as you walk around the room? And it was none of those. It was a legitimate history museum. It was not a book on a wall, and it was not a plaything or a corporate shill for Lincoln National. But by 1992, the question, what does an insurance company have to do with a museum, had occurred to many, many people. Not those who attended the museum, the 20,000 who did, not those who paid to see the museum because there was no fee. The museum didn't charge anything. It didn't charge anything for photographs in those days. You could write to them and say, I'd like 28 by 10 glossy photos of Abraham Lincoln in various poses, and they'd send them to you for free. It was a little-known but fabulous boondoggle for Lincoln researchers. Well, in 1992, the corporation decided it was not their role to operate a museum, and they began shopping the collection around to see if they could perhaps close the museum and give its collection to the Smithsonian or to the Lincoln Home in Springfield or some other place. They found, somewhat to their surprise, two things. One was that you can't just give a collection away. It's not something another institution will accept unless you give with it a sufficient bequest of money to help you pay for the maintenance and care of the collection that it requires and deserves. It would not be an ethical thing for an institution to do, to accept a collection knowing they could not properly care for it. So the insurance executives, somewhat surprised to find people didn't want their gift, realized it was not just a gift but a responsibility, a legacy that they had to care for. The second thing that happened, to perhaps their surprise, was that the public spoke up as one in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and said, don't take the museum away. We like the museum. We've been visiting it for decades. We want it here. So the museum, the company officials rather reconsidered, having found no one who would take the museum and having found a renewed public interest. They decided to rebuild the museum. They were moving the corporate headquarters from one building to another in downtown Fort Wayne, and they decided that they would move the museum as well, open a new, larger, more up-to-date Lincoln Museum in the building with the corporate headquarters. It was a building that had once been a department store. And to do that, they would need new staff members. Mark Neely had left the museum by 1992, driven out by the company's lack of appreciation for what he had done. Just about as he was leaving, he won the Pulitzer Prize. His book, The Fate of Liberty, study of Lincoln's civil rights and civil liberties policies during the war, was recognized as the best book on history published in that year. And quite to their astonishment, the people at Lincoln National realized they had not just some guy wearing thick glasses in a distant archival room in the basement of the office building. They had a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian on their hands. And they quickly shook his hand and said how pleased they were. But he was already going and went off to continue his career eventually, I think, at Washington University, St. Louis, and later today at Penn State University, where he is continuing to produce scholarship on an extraordinarily high level. And hopefully we'll have him on the show sometime. Mark is, however, a technophobe, as I recall, and when we occupied the museum, we found the only connection it had to the outside world was a single-line telephone with a rotary dial, and even for 1993, that was primitive. So it's reaching Mark by email is not something that's going to happen, and even the phone is questionable. If you write him a letter, he'll answer you the next day, but who writes letters? So Mark left the museum, went on to his wonderfully successful career afterwards. A new director was hired. She was someone who had formerly directed museums and became the first professional museum director. And I was hired at about shortly afterwards, not exactly the same time, to fill Mark's historical shoes, a huge thing for a newly graduated PhD to do. I actually hadn't even gotten the PhD at that point, so I could hardly begin to claim to replace Mark Neely in terms of his accomplishments, but I would functionally try to do the things he did and learn in his footsteps. So it was an honor to be appointed to that job. Our task in 1993 was to build the new museum, and that's what we set out to do. We were told by various consultants and people who knew what we had going here that it would take several years and a certain amount of money. We were given half that money and one-third the staff and told don't be late, and that's what we set out to do. So we'll come back in just a minute, talk about how the museum got built, and finish up with where it's going today when we return on Civil War Talk Radio.